Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in one of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflicts webinar series. My name is Azaz El-Shami, and I'm the Manager of Global Field Initiatives at ICNC. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today we have Balint Misetics, and he will discuss civil disobedience against housing evictions in Hungary, and how nonviolent direct action has been used to defend the impoverished families that are evicted from their houses. We will learn more about grassroots activist groups such as the City is for All, which brings activists living in homelessness and housing poverty to work together with allies for the right for housing for all. During the presentation, we will explore what lessons can be learned from this and how can such confrontational tactics be embedded in a broader campaign strategy. And the webinar will give us a view into how such confrontational tactics can be embedded in a broader campaign strategy, and how the struggle against eviction and the interpretation of the role of that tactics of civil resistance play in that struggle. The webinar is an hour long, and Balint will be speaking for about 30 minutes. Before we open the floor for questions, before we start the webinar, actually, I want to share with you a couple of hints on how you can share your questions. We will have time for questions and answer at the end. And if you have any questions you would like to share with the presenter, you could do so in two ways. You could use the hand raising feature within GoToWebinar, and I will then unmute you and allow you to address the speaker directly. If you wish to write your questions instead, in the bottom of your window, you will see a box titled Questions. Click on it and a text box will appear where you can type in your questions. I will then be notified and I will relay the question on your behalf. And with that, I would like to pass the presentation controls over to Balint, and while we do that, I'll just share a bit more background on him by way of introduction. Balint studied social theory and social policy in Budapest in the United States and Oxford in the UK. He's a founding member of the City for All, which is a Hungarian grassroots activist in which people living in housing poverty and their allies work together for housing rights. He's a regular trainer on nonviolent resistance, and he's working now on his PhD in social policy. He has also edited Hungarian Reader on the topic. And without any further ado, I'm gonna move it over to Balint.
Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks for joining and being interested in our work against housing evictions, and also thanks to Azaz and ICNC in general for inviting me and for organizing this webinar. Now, for the forthcoming 25 to 30 minutes, I will first briefly provide the social context of our work with respect to housing poverty and evictions in Hungary. Then I also very briefly will introduce our organization, A Város Mindenkié, which translates to the Cities for All. And then I will speak at more length about our nonviolent resistance against housing evictions, focusing particularly on why I think that even unsuccessful civil disobedience actions have their purpose, and how these more confrontational tactics are embedded in the broader campaign strategy of our work. Now, an easy way to illustrate the severity of housing poverty in Hungary is to compare the level of housing poverty with other Central Eastern European countries, such as Czech Republic, Slovakia, or Poland, which have comparable levels of economic development. And if we look at the ratio of severe housing deprivation, which captures those families who live in very bad housing in very bad condition, overcrowded, possibly leaking roof, damp or dark housing, or housing without a toilet for the sole use of household, we see that this problem is much more widespread in Hungary than in the neighboring Central Eastern European countries, and furthermore, it is even the situation is even worse for households with dependent children. Unfortunately, the same picture emerges if we look at the prevalence of arrears. So those households who, due to lack of income or insufficient income, have difficulties to pay their mortgage, rent, or utility bills on time, we see that almost every fifth person in Hungary live in households which have this problem. And again, this number is much higher than in Poland, Slovakia, or Czech Republic. And again, households with dependent children are particularly affected by this. And finally, if we look at the issue of inadequate heating, so those households who do not have enough money to heat their home adequately, we see that almost 10% of Hungarian population is affected by this problem, which translates to around a million, close to a million people. And again, this is the highest number among these 4 Central Eastern European countries. So with some confidence already, we can say that the level of housing poverty in Hungary is not attributable to the overall level of economic development of the country, but it is to a significant degree caused by flawed and unjust housing policies and social policies in general. It's also worth mentioning that since 2010, when a new government came, the government of Viktor Orbán, who you might have heard of, not only the institutional guarantees of rule of law, constitutional democracy, separation of powers, and representative democracy have been all significantly weakened, but also there has been a significant welfare state retrenchment and the modification of the distributive and redistributive mechanisms in a way which systematically favors the middle classes, and in particular the upper middle classes, and even more so the upper 10% of the income distribution, and furthermore is significantly biased against poor people in general. Among these measures of welfare state retrenchment, it is of particular importance that what has been perhaps the most progressive element of the Hungarian housing policy regime, a countrywide housing allowance scheme, this has been abolished in 2015. This has provided regular monthly support to around 500,000 households in Hungary with their utility costs. And the countrywide debt assistance scheme, which provided support for those families who were already indebted with their housing costs, has been also abolished in 2015. It's also worth mentioning that the overall stock of social rental housing or public housing in Hungary is very low in comparison to most other European countries, mainly due to the massive and fast and quite short-sighted privatization of the previously state-owned public housing stock in the early 90s. However, not only the social rental housing cannot accommodate the need for affordable housing, in fact, evictions are becoming increasingly common from the public housing stock. So here you can see how the number of evictions, and within that, the number of evictions caused by arrears has increased again since 2010. In fact, the public housing sector is one of the main sources of evictions of impoverished families, and in most of the places where we are engaged, it is against the evictions of or by local authorities that we are fighting against. For example, in 2015, on a regular day, these numbers mean that around 3 or 4 families were evicted by the local authorities alone. To sum up this brief introduction to the social situation in Hungary, we can say that evictions are caused mainly by the inadequacy of income replacement cash transfers, in particular by the inadequacy, and since 2015, the lack of housing benefit and the unavailability of debt assistance. Another important cause of evictions is the foreign currency mortgage crisis, which has emerged with the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and has affected the tens of thousands of Hungarian families. It is also important to note that there is no currently any requirement to provide any alternative accommodation in case of an eviction, not only if the people being evicted belong to such vulnerable groups as families with children, pregnant women, the elderly, long-term ill, or people with disabilities. Even though there are temporary hostels for families, these are incapable of providing an adequate alternative for many of those being evicted or being threatened by eviction, partially because of lack of capacity, but also because the regulation is such that not all types of households are eligible for that kind of service. And an important and very unfortunate, in fact, outrageous consequence of all of this is that the eviction of families often result in the separation of children from their parents, and the children being taken into foster care, which is illegal in Hungary since 1997. So it has been illegal for at least 20 years. And it is also contrary to the international legal obligations of the Hungarian state. Still, a recent report by the ombudsperson found that around 1/3 of children taken into foster care has been taken into foster care or have been taken into foster care mainly due to the poverty or homelessness of their parents. So this is a very widespread problem, and it is one of the most serious human rights violations here, which is, again, as I mentioned, oftentimes the consequence of evictions. And furthermore, it is even more widespread that families being threatened by evictions, instead of seeking help from state agencies, for this reason, need to hide from these agencies, the agencies that were supposed to help them. Now, turning on to our organization, A Város Mindenkié, which is a loose translation of the idea of the right to the city, and we usually use the translation "the cities for all." As Azaz mentioned, this is an interclass alliance between activists who are homeless, formerly homeless, or live in extreme housing poverty, and so-called ally members, such as myself, who are not directly affected by this type of housing poverty. All of our members are volunteers, so we do not have any paid staff. And the mobilization of people living in housing poverty and the inclusion of homeless people into our work is actually one of our main goals, both for reasons of ethics and political philosophy, but also for strategic considerations, because we think that the best, most efficient antidote to the kind of stigmatization and moral exclusion that homeless people face is when homeless people themselves take a stand and speak out for their own rights and for the rights and interests of their fellow citizens. So this is not an organization in which well-intentioned middle-class people work for the homeless or on behalf of homeless people, but this is an organization in which most of the members are themselves homeless or live in extreme housing poverty. One of the most important social injustices we have been fighting against since 2009 is evictions. We have been campaigning against evictions. Here you can see our annual march for the right to housing, with our members holding a banner which says, "We demand an immediate stop on evictions without the provision of an adequate alternative." We also more recently started a campaign for a specific legal change. We formulated and introduced a draft law which would have prohibited the eviction of families with children without the provision of an adequate alternative. And while unfortunately the governing party did not support our initiative, the campaign was still successful in bringing the issue of evictions to the forefront of public debate, and also all the significant opposition parties either signed up to our campaign or later on expressed their agreement with our proposals. We also have an associate organization called Street Lawyer Association, which provides free legal aid and legal information to people living in housing poverty, and for people who have housing problems, especially in case of evictions, and which is also engaged from time to time in strategic litigation about housing rights. We are also involved in what could be referred to as micro-level advocacy, where on a case-by-case basis, we work together with families threatened with eviction to find a solution with the landowner, most of the times the local authority, and to negotiate a settlement which allows the family to remain in their home. And finally, if none of this has been successful, we turn to civil disobedience, which in the case of evictions essentially mean anti-eviction human blockades or living chains, thereby which we physically obstruct the eviction of an impoverished family, at least as long as we are not arrested if the civil disobedience action was not successful. Now, what have been the results of these nonviolent direct actions against evictions? To oversimplify a bit, there are three major outcomes. One, of course, is when the civil disobedience was successful in preventing or delaying an eviction. This is a straightforward case of success. The opposite of this is when the civil disobedience action was unsuccessful in preventing the eviction in question, in which case the nonviolent direct action at least created a certain scandal, raised awareness among the general public, brought the issue to the media, and thereby also increased the political costs of further evictions. And this is very important because I believe it is just to understand evictions as a type of violence, structural violence, if you wish. However, this is a kind of violence inflicted upon impoverished families, which is not directly perceived and understood as being violence. And if there is resistance against an eviction, and if the police needs to forcefully remove activists defending the family and perhaps forcefully arrest those involved, then this kind of violence, which has been already present all along in the eviction, becomes immediately visible and understandable, and that is the main mechanism of effect through which the civil disobedience actions can increase the political costs of further evictions. Of course, I'm referring to the mechanism that has been referred to as by various authors in the civil resistance research literature as political jujitsu, or backfire, or communicative suffering, all of which refer to the mechanism through which the kind of forceful intervention on part of the authorities end up creating more political costs on the side of those responsible for these measures and for the evictions than on the side of those these measures are directly inflicted upon or directed against. Now, the third outcome is when there's no need to actually practice or engage in civil disobedience because the declaration of an ultimatum to the local authority does the job. So when the local authority has to decide whether to proceed with the eviction, and in that case expect resistance or to find another solution, in certain occasions local authorities decide not to proceed with the evictions because they know the kinds of bad publicity and political costs that would entail if there is also a nonviolent direct action against that eviction. Now, to rephrase all of this in a somewhat more analytical manner, we can say that civil disobedience actions against evictions can be either technically successful or unsuccessful. In case of success, the most straightforward case is when the civil disobedience succeeds in preventing the eviction in the long run, and thereby the family in question can secure their housing, possibly participate in some sort of debt assistance scheme, but in any case can remain in their homes in the long run. A less successful outcome is when the civil disobedience can only delay the eviction, but that still leaves more time and therefore provides more chance to the family to secure some sort of alternative housing, especially because the kind of media publicity that comes with the involvement of our organization in the case might facilitate some help or in-kind or even cash donations from the citizenry who've seen the case perhaps on the news, the evening news, and wanted to help. Now, turning to the unsuccessful cases of civil disobedience, we could say that the only thing these civil disobedience actions can do, in fact, is to create some sort of a scandal and some sort of increased awareness of the situation. However, this is also quite important because by bringing these evictions into the evening news, they increase the political costs of further evictions, and therefore they create a disincentive for local authorities to pursue further evictions. And furthermore, again, the kind of publicity that comes along might help the evicted family to find some other alternative housing. In fact, unsuccessful civil disobedience actions are more likely to generate that kind of empathy on part of the public, partially because these cases are also more likely to be presented in the evening news. Now, the main point I want to make, however, is that these unsuccessful civil disobedience actions are of crucial importance for the possibility of subsequent successful civil disobedience actions, because it is only through unsuccessful civil disobedience actions that local politicians and local decision makers can learn about the kinds of bad publicity and the kind of political costs that they would experience if they decide to proceed with the evictions. And it is through some of the unsuccessful civil disobedience actions that they can be taught that even disregarding humanitarian considerations, it might be wise for them not to proceed with the evictions because it's just not worth it for them, politically speaking. Now, turning to how all of this relates to our broader campaign strategy, all the activities we are involved in, all of the activities we are involved in concerning evictions can be broadly grouped into either campaigning methods or the aforementioned micro-level advocacy and direct help efforts. A lot of people threatened by evictions find us and seek out help from us, either on the phone or in person or via email or on Facebook. We have an emergency response system through which we try to handle the most urgent cases, so cases in which the eviction is due within a week. And for the less urgent cases, we organize a mutual aid group called Together for Our Housing, where the idea is that people with similar problems, housing problems, can share their experiences and can try to help each other. And this is also meant to facilitate a more collective approach to evictions and housing problems instead of a traditional individual casework logic, which is usually present in other charitable organizations. Now, in terms of campaigning, I already mentioned our annual March for the Right to Housing, which is usually our largest march or protest in the year. We also regularly organize awareness-raising actions at the end of the winter moratorium on evictions. We formulate and express housing policy demands, and more recently, we also started to formulate and represent very concrete policy proposals for the prevention of evictions in the form of a draft law which has been submitted to the Hungarian parliament a few weeks ago. And where does civil disobedience or nonviolent direct action comes into all of this? Well, first of all, because of the kind of publicity that civil disobedience actions can facilitate, it is an important avenue for representing our housing policy demands and for representing our policy proposals, which can thereby reach more people, and perhaps also can reach a more fertile ground, as more people might be aware of the kinds of injustice, violence, or even cruelty that is involved in the practice of evictions. Furthermore, civil disobedience actions are also important because they raise awareness not only about the problem among the general public, they also raise awareness among people being threatened by eviction about our work. So we have actually, I mean, we do not have a research on this, but we have the impression that if we are engaged in civil disobedience more frequently, then there's a positive feedback loop, thereby which more families know about us and more families can reach out to us with similar problems. And finally, it is through civil disobedience actions that the bargaining position of our group and also of families threatened by eviction who we aid and sometimes represent is strengthened. So it is easier to find a solution or some sort of consensus or to reach a compromise when the other party, oftentimes the local authority, must know that if there is no consensus made and if there is no consensus found, and if there is no compromise on their part, they need to expect more confrontational tactics with all the aforementioned bad publicity and political costs that entails. I'm running out of time, so maybe I would just mention briefly some of the challenges that we are facing in all of this. Well, first of all, it is hard to mobilize enough people to these actions, not mostly because of the inconveniences that a possible arrest or a possible criminal procedure entails, but because these evictions are usually on working days, on working hours, and therefore most people who are sympathetic to our goals have difficulties being there because of their other non-negotiable responsibilities. And furthermore, oftentimes families threatened with evictions only find us at the very last minute, so we have sometimes only a few days to organize a non-violent direct action. It is also challenging to mobilize specifically people living in poverty into these actions, even though that would be very important both for ethical and strategic reasons, because people living in poverty oftentimes have even less leeway in terms of not going to work or in terms of organizing someone to take care of their children, and they also might face more significant legal consequences if they participated. And another additional factor is that as far as our homeless members are concerned, they tend to be in ill health, and some of them are not even able to stand for 4 or 6 hours if necessary in such an action. Another important challenge is what I here referred to as transforming clients to activists, by which I mean that many people living in housing poverty are socialized into a kind of client role by charitable organizations and state welfare organizations. And this is really not our approach to these issues. We are not a charitable organization. We are an activist organization. And this transformation is perhaps the most important, but it's also very challenging to allow these people to not only seek help from us, but also to participate in the struggle against other evictions. So to participate in work that is not directly related to their own case, and therefore to facilitate some sort of solidarity and mutual aid. That is a very important challenge. which I wouldn't blame on the families concerned, of course, because they are about, or they are at least threatened with losing their homes. But in any case, our work depends on the assumption that this transformation must be possible. And of course, there are also some further challenges with respect to the overall political situation of Hungary. Essentially, we are swimming against the tide. There is a democratic backsliding going on in Hungary and has been in the past 8 years. And the current regime has a characteristically and explicitly anti-welfare state ideology, which makes it hardly possible for our pro-poor or egalitarian housing proposals to be implemented any sooner, or without a change in the political situation, and more concretely, without the change of government. And furthermore, there is an extreme level of pro-government media hegemony. So most media is either now directly or indirectly controlled by the government or pro-government oligarchs, which means that the public discourse itself is very divided. And even if we are successful in bringing the issue of evictions, the injustices and violence involved in evictions, and the responsibility of the state and of the local authorities in all of this, there's a great chance that it wouldn't reach a significant part of Hungarian society who consume, for the most part, only pro-government media outlets. And therefore, even though from a political point of view, it would be perhaps the most important to expose all of this to the pro-government part of the electorate, and to convince them that the type of policies that the government is pursuing about evictions is just indefensible. These are the people who we have the most difficulties in reaching. And so this, in a way, makes it harder to make the kinds of political costs that I have referred to earlier more effective, because local decision makers can be confident that a significant part of the media will not cover these events. And even if they do, these covers will be extremely biased in favor of the local authority or the government, and extremely biased against impoverished families. So these are the main challenges that we are facing, and these are the main ways through which we utilize methods of nonviolent resistance, and the main ways we think that they should be and could be embedded in a broader campaign strategy. With that, I would give back the floor to Azaz, and I hope that you would have questions and that we can have a discussion about all of this in the forthcoming 20 or 30 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Balint. That's a very, very encouraging presentation. And I really, really admire how you mixed a lot of tools and techniques together. There are a couple of questions that we have, and one of them you did allude to and you did answer, but it's basically, I'm more interested to learn more. How did you manage to convince those who are very sympathetic to the case, but might have some emotional barrier to be arrested, for instance, for doing disobedience? You know, there's a lot of people who can be sympathizers, but not necessarily they're like a little bit risk adverse. There were a certain way that you shared with that. Did you have any attempts to test the water to see how the police would react? Did you have your legal aid ready to help? How did you overcome that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, it is important to know that even though there have been some occasions in which the police was not professional enough, and also therefore was more violent than it would have been necessary, police brutality against activists or against the opposition in general is not a serious issue in Hungary. There are all sorts of other ways in which this regime is becoming increasingly authoritarian, increasingly oppressive, but police law enforcement, at least as far as activists and the opposition is concerned, or protests are concerned, is an important exception. And so at least in the capital, if you are an activist and surrounded by cameras, you really do not need to be afraid of unnecessary police violence. So you might get arrested, and you might be subjected to a court procedure for a misdemeanor charge, but the kinds of risks that you take can, with high confidence, be predicted, and that is an important aspect of all of this. But of course, we also provide training in nonviolent resistance, or training in civil disobedience, and in particular training in how to resist nonviolently a police law enforcement effort. So that helps a lot of people. In like that allows them to participate, not to be afraid of it. And of course, we also provide legal aid after the procedure. So I think that it is not fear of police law enforcement which is the largest obstacle to mobilize more people, but the fact that we oftentimes do not have enough time to mobilize people, and furthermore that these are actions which are always on working days and working hours, and so people need to have that sort of commitment to the cause to, you know, ask for a vacation day in their job, and also they need to be in a position of doing so. Or people need to be students or freelancers, and in fact students and freelancers are overrepresented among our participants for this very reason.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question here from Dolly. She's asking about how are you managing the difficult conversation around anti-welfare state ideology? What have been the most effective arguments you have raised that are changing some people's minds about the kind of government and country the broad populace want to have?
Yes. Well, this is a difficult question, partially because there's essentially no public debate now in Hungary. So you can reach the opposition part or independent part of the media, which is likely to be sympathetic to the cause, or at least is not hostile to it. But you have very significant difficulties reaching to anywhere else. And it is for this reason, it is hard for us, for example, to have a public debate with a government representative or anyone like that, because they are just not willing to be engaged in such public debate. Now, with respect to evictions, it is not by accident that we have been struggling now for the introduction of a law which would have specifically protected families with children. Now, we think that evicting any poor person without the provision of some alternative housing is unjust, and in fact it is a human rights violation. But it is not this long-term goal that we formulated into a policy proposal, but instead we focused on families with children. And if the question is framed in this way, it is very hard for anyone to publicly say that, yes, I'm in favor of the legal possibility of throwing out families with children onto the street. So we framed the question in a way which we believe made it more acceptable to the general public, or to the median voter, if you wish, as a first step, by focusing on families with children. So that is one one way we have been trying to convince others of our cause.
Great, thank you. I have another question is about how you're giving those who are immediately affected by those new policies the sense of agency, making them not client, but rather active participants. Given that most of them having like difficulties finding a house and therefore could have issues with making a living, how was it possible for you, since you're only based on volunteer network, to convene them, to train them, and to convince them actually while they're facing this like a very existential threat of not having a house, to take part in the non-violent struggle action? How was that possible to convince them, to train them, to mobilize them, given the very liquid, fluid structure of your organization and the volunteer-based system that you have?
Yes, this is again a very good question. Thank you. So it is indeed an issue that, because involvement in our work requires or tends to require quite a lot of time, we are better in mobilizing or recruiting and then keeping people living in housing poverty who do not live in families, because the kind of involvement that this entails and the kind of community they belong to, consequently, is more important to them. It's more of a resource to them, whereas for people with families, it is more of a liability to spend, maybe 2 evenings a week in various organizing meetings or trainings. So that is another major challenge, in particular with respect to evictions, because it is more likely for families being threatened by evictions to have children, so to live in families. Now, on a more positive note, and returning to this community aspect, it already has some encouraging or empowering aspect, that those who decide to work together with us, even in their own case or in general in our work, thereby they can participate in a community which crosscuts class boundaries and also ethnic boundaries. And the poorest of Hungarian citizens often live in segregated living environments, and oftentimes have a somewhat adversary relationship with authorities, and sometimes that is the only way through which they get in contact with middle class people. It can be the boss, or it can be a child welfare authority, or a social worker, and these are characteristically inegalitarian, so unequal relationships. And so if someone joins our work, she or he at least has the experience of working in a community in which people who are, so to speak, well dressed and speak nicely, by which I mean speak as a middle class intellectual or a university educated person, and well educated, and knows a lot about these legal stuff and so on. And all of this happens in a very egalitarian and an explicitly egalitarian manner and atmosphere. And so that is already in a way encouragement. And the fact of not being alone with the problem is also very important. I wouldn't be able to say, such in a way pathetic way, but one of our homeless members, after an unsuccessful civil disobedience action, said that then everyone was really sad and really disappointed, and he said that, well, it was definitely worth doing, because these people now, like, they had to leave their homes, but they weren't alone, and they could leave their homes dignity because they weren't alone. So it was not like no one cares what happens to them. And they knew, and other people also saw that there are people who think that this is unjust and who were on the side of the family. And finally, the media is important even in this respect. So it is our policy which prioritizes almost exclusively the people directly affected by evictions or homelessness as spokespersons, is important not only for the education of the broader public that these people are just like everyone else. They can speak in the television, and they can make good points about how this society works. It is also important as a source of empowerment because it gives you the impression that you are listened to. If you are quoted in the evening news, that gives you the impression that your opinion matters, because it did reach at that point maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So these are all sources of empowerment. But as I mentioned, it is very hard, and for a lot of people who do find us with their housing problems, they end up not joining our work, and that's fine, because it wouldn't be reasonable or fair to expect that all people in all circumstances can spend their spare time, if they have any spare time, to fight for these causes. But some people do, and it is those people who do with whom then we can try to reach out to even more people.
Great, excellent. And I love what one of the participants said, because I feel like you really your efforts and your organization have brought it home that success has many definitions, and it might not stop the eviction, but as you said, it's giving this sense of community, giving this sense of agency, and allowing people to be there for one another. I have two questions before we wrap up, and one of them is, how did it ever happen that in your organization or in your efforts that any group decided to go violent out of frustration or something like that? And if it did occur, how did you manage that? And I will wait for the second question after you finish with this one.
Okay. Fortunately, this hasn't been an issue. So the political culture, even among activists, is biased in favor of nonviolence in Hungary. So the kind of discussions that oftentimes activists dedicated to the idea of nonviolence or nonviolent militancy need to be engaged in is not as important in Hungary. So it is very rare that you would need to defend the commitment of nonviolence, because most people already agree that nonviolent tactics have important ethical as well as tactical or strategic advantages over anything else. And as I mentioned, the police usually also does not provoke anything like that, which is also part of this political culture. So this hasn't been a very important issue, but we do, in our trainings, we do emphasize both the moral reasons for nonviolence and the strategic reasons for doing so. And so we had the fortune of working together with a pool of activists who are either committed to nonviolence from an ethical point of view, or who are at least disciplined enough not to engage in anything that is either violent or can be perceived as being violent.
Okay, excellent. I just have a last question. If I'm just wondering if those who are subject for to be evicted from their houses, is it only economic? Are there any underlying discrimination towards race, sexual orientation, or something like that, or it's just purely economic without any underlying discrimination? associated with it?
Yes, again, an excellent question. So Roma people, sometimes referred to as gypsies. So Roma Hungarians are overrepresented significantly among those families we try to protect from evictions. This is mainly, I think, due to their overrepresentation among extremely impoverished families living in public housing units. But in certain occasions, there is also the well-founded suspicion, to frame it that way, that some sort of ethnic discrimination has also played a part. And then there is at least an implicit intention of getting rid of poor Roma Hungarian families from the public housing stock or from that part of the district or that part of the city in general. So there is an overrepresentation, a significant overrepresentation among the families we are working together with of Roma Hungarians. But on a more strategic note, I think it's worth noting that before our anti-eviction struggle, so in the early 2000s and even before that, there was a quite important organization called the Roma Foundation for Civil Rights. And they also organized against evictions, and they also engaged in civil disobedience, sometimes against evictions, and oftentimes, or most of the times, they framed it not along class lines, but among ethnic lines. And even though we do not, we are not silent, obviously, about the fact if there is an implicit or explicit agenda of the local authority to discriminate against or to push out Roma residents. This ethnic dimension is, however, not what we emphasize, because in most of the cases, it is poor families who are targeted, and extremely poor families, especially in public housing units in Budapest, tend to be are more likely to be Roma. And I think that this framing of the issue as a how to say that, a more universalistic social justice issue, and by framing it along class lines, I think it is easier for the general public to relate to these issues with more sympathy and more empathy, because one of the important factors of anti-welfare state sentiments, or sentiments against poor people, or sentiments against unemployed people, is in fact anti-Roma prejudices. So there is a strong and there's a strong relationship between anti-poor sentiments and anti-Roma prejudices, and by emphasizing the class-based nature of what's going on, the overarching distributive injustices involved, and the negligence and responsibility of local authorities concerning poor people in general, I think it is easier to to convince the broader public about the injustices of evictions.
Okay, this is excellent. It's a very smart way to maneuver the nuanced details of a society and what appeals more to the public opinion versus which one of how to tone the message is very important, and it's very characteristic for each struggle. My last question before we wrap up, and thank you so much for your patience and very thorough and eloquent responses, is that if these evictions are basically, are they part of a gentrification? Are these like public housing going to be turned into something more profitable? Is that the underlying reason? Or is just a basic turnover. It's just like taking one poor out and bringing one poor in, or it's part of a bigger system or bigger change where the government or the municipality is trying to use these areas for another more profitable buildings or something like that.
Yes, well, there are more aspects of this. One is that evictions are the consequence of countrywide social policy measures, anti-poor social policy measures that have many consequences, and one of the consequences of that is an increase in evictions. So if the local authority is neutral, there would be still more evictions because of the kind of social policies that the government is pursuing. Now, another part of it is the turnover that you mentioned, but this is more. This is more of an attempt to legitimize these evictions, you know, by referring to all the other poor families who would pay their rents regularly and who have no housing and who could move into these houses. So I don't think that this is the main reason, even though this comes up quite often on part of the local authorities' efforts to legitimize and make these evictions more acceptable. And gentrification is part of the problem, definitely. So we are now mostly involved in an anti-eviction campaign in the 10th district, which is in the outskirts of Budapest, and there's a large public housing building with more than 70 social housing flats, which is threatened by demolition because a fancy new complex of office spaces and some gated communities perhaps are being planned to be built in the immediate proximity of that building, and so a lot of families are now being threatened with eviction with that. So that is a clear case when such processes that could be referred to as gentrification plays a very important role, perhaps the dominant role in the evictions. But in most of the cases, the relationship with that is more subtle and more hidden and less explicit, even in terms of the motivation for the evictions, and just has to do with the fact that local authorities, because of the way social housing is regulated and financed in Hungary, mostly think that they are just not interested in having these units, and they're not interested in renovating them, and they're not interested in keeping families who in the district or in that part of town who are poor. So that is perhaps a more important reason. And before concluding, I just wanted to ask our attendees if they could say where they are from, because I'm sure my fellow activists would be very excited to know about for how many different places people and fellow activists perhaps from all around the world joined to know a little bit more about our work. That would be encouraging for them to know.
Yeah, sure. I can share with you their geographic location. I'm not sure, like many of them are open to speak, since most of them share their question through the question box. So I will share with you the location of them without disclosing their names or identity.
Okay.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that. And kudos to you and to your group. And I hope less eviction will take place and more people will have agency, and together you will be able to address the root causes and the genesis of the issue, and to have more just social justice system that does not punish the poor twice. And with that, I'll just take over and I'll switch the screen to me. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have enjoyed and took wisdom nuggets from Balint presentation today, we will be sending you a link to this presentation in a couple of days. And I just want to thank you for listening. And please, please answer the survey at the end of this webinar, and try to connect with us if you haven't so already. And also, we're going to be having a presentation in May on the 24th about the co-resistance and normalization, the past and the future of Israeli-Palestinian joint civil resistance against the occupation. It's going to be presented by Dr. Saad Ashtan. He's a professor of peace and conflict studies at the Sophomore College. It's going to be on May 24th at noon. Please do register, do join us, share your ideas, and we look forward to being with you in the next session. Thank you so much, and goodbye.